the top 9, 10 reasons why paganism, neo-paganism, ain't really a thing, or AKA is false. First of all, this is a rising trend, especially amongst dissident people out there who are looking for authenticity, looking for tradition, and so forth, which is understandable. But there isn't, first of all, a pagan tradition. So number 10 is going to be that there isn't such a thing. Pagan traditions themselves have always been a reconstruction, something in flux. And so the idea that you can dig up some old pagan tradition isn't really feasible. I mean, what is the pagan tradition, right? Is it Rome? Is it Babylon? Is it Egypt? I mean, these traditions, in a sense, adopted older traditions, and they incorporated the gods into their new system when the old gods were conquered. But the idea that there's tribal paganism against imperial paganism poses a bit of a problem. Because how do you know which one is the authentic paganism? Is it the barbarians that fought Rome? Or is it Roman imperial paganism? So in other words, there's no way really to delineate the true or the false from these various traditions. And if a person says, well, that's how this thing works, you don't have to accept a universal principle or standard. Well, we'll get to why that's a problem in a moment. But basically this means there's not really a philosophy. There's not really a worldview of paganism or neo-paganism. Meaning there's not a consistent, coherent morals, epistemology, or knowledge and metaphysics. They might have views of epistemology. They might have views of metaphysics in basically an anti-ethical position, but there's not really a consistent, coherent worldview of all those working together, especially when we get to the notion of fate in a moment. So if it's a reconstructed tradition, then it's not real. It's sort of evolving. It's in flux. And that brings me to the fact that if there's not a real tradition, then how do you have a succession of this? And I think a lot of pagans want to find a tribal succession. They want to find who the handed down lineage. I mean, the idea of tradition presupposes a thing handed down. But handed down from what source? So there needs to be a succession, but that's the immediate problem in a position that has always been basically a reconstruction of something in the past. Who's the authentic successor? Who has the authentic tradition? And so, in a sense, ultimately, it's a contradiction because it's atheistic on the one hand and anti-supernatural in many segments. Many atheists are disaffected and they become interested in spirituality. They become neo-pagans. And then they retain their atheistic, rationalist attitude towards the gods or the deities. But if the gods or the deities aren't real, then there's not really any meaning to paganism other than it being a kind of social organization. And so if it's not a real thing, if it's a social organization, then what's the point of the gods? What's the point of the myths? That's, in fact, the movement that happens in Hellenic philosophy is out of myths and stories, Iliad, Odyssey, to rational philosophy, right? Plato and Aristotle. So the question is really either you maintain the notion of the transcendent and you admit the gods are real metaphysical beings, or you are basically an atheist and there's not really any paganism anyway. You're just another form of materialist. But if the gods are real, then what governs this worldview, the ultimate principle, is the fates or chaos. And the fates or chaos can't be a unifying principle because everything's in chaos. It's disunified. It's a dysteleological worldview seeking for meaning or teleology. Number 5, this leads to the next point, which is that He-Man isn't real. Number 4, it's a reaction to liberalized Christianity. And so a lot of people are reacting to the morass of our day, the postmodernity of our day, which is an outworking of the liberalism of the Enlightenment and the modern period, modernism. But this is not a good reason to accept a countervailing position just because of your reaction to the existing thing. But the system knows that people have a prevalence towards reaction, especially when they're young, and so they will try to corral you into these kinds of movements, especially when you're 18, 19, 20, and you're very idealistic. But in reality, a lot of these groups are tolerated and promoted by the system, as we'll see. there's not really a consistent idea either of the tribe or the group. I'm not saying there aren't, but I'm saying there's fuzzy edges there such that there's not a real coherent way, even if you did try to base it in tribalism, to actually make this a workable metaphysical system or an epistemology. It would be purely relativized, and that's going to be the main critique here in a moment. And so if chaos and fate reign, this is down to number 3, then what you have is essentially no unifying metaphysical principle, no unifying ethical principle, no unifying epistemological principle. And so the worldview doesn't work. It's not coherent. And some pagans might be willing to say, well, I affirm the acceptance of inconsistency and contradiction. Well, if that's the case, then paganism can't be true. So why are you following something that isn't true? And they might say, well, I want to follow the false. Oh, okay, well, if you want to follow the false, then there's no longer true or false, you see. That removes the possibility of truth values and truth propositions. And so ultimately then, as I said, this leads to relativism. But the second point before I get to number 1 is that these are useful religious or ideological movements that are being allowed or even at times promoted by the global elite because they promote earth worship and ultimately Depop and sustainability. And so they will use these movements to corral people into something like a global religion or something like that. And it's fine for you to have your little enclave in the farm. You can have your little pen where you do your thing, but as long as you are integrated into the global animal farm, then you're not a problem. And that's exactly what the tribal subdivisions do. In other words, it's useful for controlling and social engineering. And then finally, ultimately, it is a relativistic system. Every one of the debates that we've done 4 or 5 debates now with neo-pagans, and we found out that every one of them has a relativistic ethic and a relativistic metaphysic and a relativistic epistemology. And if it's all relative, then there's no way to combat the things that you think you're critiquing. How do you critique Christianity if your system is relativistic? It doesn't have a grounding for its ethic. I mean, if nothing's right and wrong, then there's no basis to critique. You need a standard to justify, give an account for the value judgments to say something is good, bad, right? We should follow strength and willpower over against the weak. And if Christianity is weakness and paganism is strength and willpower, then why was paganism so easily conquered in the pagan worldview, right? The pagan view is that Christianity subverted and took over and destroyed people groups, right? But if that's the case, then how were you really strong and defined by your willpower and your, beards and ponytails? I mean, Viking ponytails, right? Is that strength? And if that's strength, then why were you so easily subverted, according to your account? And ultimately, as I said, if you say that postmodernity is degenerate, then what's the standard for determining degeneracy? Because sometimes they'll say, well, but not every pagan was as degenerate as the others, so paganism isn't necessarily degenerate. But why not? Why not choose the more degenerate? Why not make me God Emperor and let me have your wives in my harem, right? There's no reason, there's no oughts, in other words, just like Hume would say. So ultimately, I think these are really devastating problems for any kind of pagan or neo-pagan movement. And remember, if you want to see more on this, I've done multiple live streams, multiple debates with neo-pagans. And you can also combat your inner soy, your inner weakness, by pumping up your toxic masculine with the Chalk Daily, or with the ashwagandha, or with the Tomcat Ali. Any of these are excellent products. You get 50% off. You get 50% off, boy, if you go over to chalk.com right now, put in the promo code J50, and you'll get 50% off all of these products, which will help you combat your inner soy. Fight against toxic soy products with toxic masculinity. So beef up your toxic masculinity over at chalk.com.